Hi, I'm Janice.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. This week we're going to do a continuation of last week's where we were starting to deep dive into the various things that Darren and I track. So I'm going to turn it over to you for a little more detail, Darren, before we dive in.
Yeah, so when Janice and I first started speaking, as I alluded to in the first episode, we originally were talking about UAP, and that was kind of how we both knew about each other. But then once we actually continued our conversations, it pretty quickly grew into a much larger conversation about the nature of reality and, again, the really consequential times we are living through. And we found that we were each tracking some very similar trends in the world around these different but consequential matters co-arising in our time. And we've talked about this a couple times now already. Again, this is where the notion of event horizon comes in, that we are at a crux point in human history with both possibilities that are promising and transformative in their potential, while also facing some challenges that are quite overwhelming, quite daunting. Today, we wanted to dive into a few more specifics about some topics that are within that list of what we track. We're going to begin with one of the big ones everyone's aware of, climate. So take it away, Janice.
All right, thanks. Well, before we dive right into climate, I just wanted to say what makes this time so unique is just how utterly fascinating it is. There's so much coming out into the open, or if we're talking about UAP in particular, coming out into the open. But there's also so much on the sort of technology front and physics front and just understanding life and the origins of life and the universe. Anyway, so I think, for me, that the fascination, I'm hoping that people will keep that in mind and let their own fascination kind of take over and not just hear it through the veil of what it means for humanity or doesn't mean, because the reality is we don't really know, right? But anyway, so we won't be too overwhelming, but I will start with one I know that everybody is experiencing firsthand, or at least, it's very salient for all of us, and that's climate. I'm sure everybody listening grew up with some knowing that we were headed toward potentially some really hard times if we didn't do something. I know there are a lot of different theories about how we got here, which may or may not have a lot to do with what humans did, and I'm not commenting on that at this point. But I know that we all heard about it, right? It's just like been a part of the buzz since we were young, and it has gotten more and more intense, and it really has gotten more and more intense. Like, we have started to leave the charts, really. So, for example, Earth's temperature has risen by about 2 degrees since 1850, which is a lot. I know it doesn't seem like a lot, but it's really, really fast. 2023 started to leave all records behind. I remember vividly seeing a chart in March of 2023. I think it was ocean temperatures, and it was crazy, way above even the highest line or trend line. And then this year's is even much further above that. So it's sobering, and something's happening, and I think this is one of those areas where the word unprecedented shows up all over the place. I mean, just in the last 2 weeks, we've had headlines like this: the 10 warmest years in the historical record have all occurred in the past decade. Pittsburgh area experiencing unprecedented tornado season. South Sudan braces for unprecedented floods. This was just all in the last few days. Unprecedented volcanic activity observed at Iran's Mount Taftan. And the Great Barrier Reef, as I think you all know, is facing unprecedented coral bleaching. So it's really, I don't want to go too far in, and I want you to be able to jump in, Darren. And this is one of the ones I have to admit, personally, it's a little harder for me to feel fascinated by. As we go deeper in, we're going to get more and more into the fascination area. This is just one of the ones that makes me really sad for everything. Anyway, this is time for you to jump in now.
Yeah, so absolutely. It's one of the ones that's the most daunting, probably because it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And to some degree, the when is already happening. We, as Janice just alluded to, we are seeing that even the predictions of the models are being eclipsed by what we're actually seeing in the numbers the last couple of years. We know that El Nino was a factor in why perhaps ocean temperatures were higher than normal, but nevertheless, even when you account for that, they were remarkably high. And as we've talked about, I think in the first episode, it's definitely something that Janice and I have talked about. When you have ocean temperatures in the Atlantic that are that high, you run the risk of seeing the North Atlantic current collapse. And that will really impact places like South America and Northern Europe in some pretty drastic ways. We're not talking about subtle changes in lifestyle. We're talking about the tenability of civilization in some of those places. And of course, then you get the knock-on effects of people being displaced and having to move because of climate change. And then you get civil strife that arises and geopolitical strife that arises because of that movement of people. When we think about what happened with the European Union when it came into being, everyone was excited and thinking this was a great notion of moving forward together. But then when you actually saw people groups moving from poorer countries in Eastern Europe into the West, then that created tensions and people felt like maybe we should have kept the borders where they were, these kinds of things. So there's going to be many, many knock-on effects when it comes to climate because we might draw these lines, the imaginary lines of borders, but climate doesn't know that. And people are going to have to find ways to find places to move to survive some of this. So it is daunting, and it will make us, I think, really reflect on what is it to be a human being? What is it to be an American or a British person or a German or an Australian or a Japanese person? What does this mean when we as a civilization are facing some of these challenges? Are we going to just double down and put up walls, or are we going to try to find ways to build bridges and try to tackle this together? And this, of course, will also mean dealing with some of the intense energy, both individually and as a collective. How are we going to respond? Are we going to reduce to the lowest common denominator and be protective, or are we going to try to reach across in compassion for our neighbors, especially if they are more directly impacted than us? These are some of the questions we have to ask. And again, while it is an issue of degrees and changings of weather and things like that, it's also fundamentally a consciousness question because of this matter of how we will deal with it together or not.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, especially since I know for me, at least, it has made every day really precious. It's made me really care in ways and make me think a lot about how I want to spend my time. A lot of this stuff does. But I'm like, how do I really want to spend this time? So I think there are a lot of ways in which we can come together and within ourselves use this as an opportunity for growth. I do think that we definitely need to start thinking about how we're going to give and how we're going to support not just ourselves and our little clans, because that isn't going to cut it, right? We're going to have to collaborate. I don't know if sitting at the border shooting people when they start coming north is a strategy, honestly. But it really does bring up this question you just mentioned about what does it mean to be human. I think we're going to find out.
We all feel it because whether or not we're in a part of the world that right now is seeing extreme weather, we know that it's just a matter of time. And the thing with climate is that it is global. So as much as we've acted like we are distinct people groups with these borders that are imaginary on maps, they don't exist on the planet itself, we are going to actually see that the way this works is that it's all connected. One piece I will add there's a positive spin on this is that sometimes in times of emergency, you do see people come together and form communities and really change how they think about what really matters. And I lived in a city one time that was having this forest fire was encroaching the entire city. And it was amazing the sense of community that came together when that was happening. People were loving on the firefighters and the police force that were helping people, and people were volunteering to help people who had lost their homes and that kind of thing. And once things went, quote unquote, back to normal, it kind of felt to me like we actually had lost something in terms of that sense of community. So sometimes, be careful what you wish for, because sometimes it's actually challenges that produce the wake-up call that makes us people come together in ways that comfort zones don't necessarily do.
That is such a great point. And that is exactly the opportunity, right? I'm saying yes, I'll do it. Here we are, we're starting. All right, so I know the next topic is not a whole lot more uplifting, but I promise it gets a little at least more interesting from there. So next up is the geopolitical situation, which, again, I'm sure everybody's quite aware of. So Darren's going to give us a rundown on what you're noticing about that.
Yeah, so we're going to start here with some of the heavier ones and then move to some positive towards the end here. But geopolitical strife is another one of these trends we track that, again, if we're getting down to the real key aspect of this, is that these are potentially extinction level kinds of threats. So that's true of climate. It's also true of geopolitical strife because, again, we do not live in a civilization that fights with cannonballs and sticks and stones and swords. but we actually have nuclear weapons. We have bioweapons, these kinds of things. So the catastrophic nature of some of these weapons is such that it wouldn't take much for this to quickly escalate into something that would be like a global thermonuclear war. And that is bad news for everyone. We know that there have been models created to try to walk out what this would look like. And unfortunately, because the two superpowers, especially in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, which is now Russia, of course, and the United States, the strategy has been, and Annie Jacobson has spoken about this in a recent book she published, that if you pick up on your radar that there are incomings in terms of nuclear weapons, you fire your entire arsenal. And both have that as their strategy, basically. So then you don't just have the initial mortality in those countries themselves, but it creates a nuclear winter scenario where so much of the sky is blocked out by this cloud for months, even years, I think, under some models, that it would basically choke out most life, like 90% of life in the world. So then it becomes an extinction level threat, not just to us as a civilization, as humanity, but to so many of the other species across the biosphere as well. So we're aware of the thermonuclear challenge, but there are some other things going on in terms of actual tensions right now that are rising in the world. The first one, of course, is the Russia-Ukraine war. This war began in 2022 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has led already to significant casualties, displacement of populations, like we talked about with climate, and economic disruptions. Of course, this is in some ways carrying on of the same consciousness energy situation vortex from the Cold War, that when the Soviet Union collapsed, there are many people in Russia, Vladimir Putin being one, who really didn't like to see the Soviet Union fall apart and has always sort of still looked at these satellite nations as really being part of the Soviet Union. And so it was just a matter of time, many people would argue, before he finally invaded Ukraine. And indeed, that happened in 2022. That's just one. Now, to make the point here, though, this conflict has heightened tensions between NATO and Russia. And because NATO, United States, Canada, UK, all these countries that are part of NATO, are supporting Ukraine and arming Ukraine, that increases the chance that Russia will eventually see that we are actually at war with them. And right now, one of the things that's going on, for instance, is that Ukraine is asking to be able to use U.S.-provided weapons to launch attacks into Russia. And right now, the United States government has been saying, no, we don't agree to that, because that is too much like a direct conflict between the United States and Russia. But this is what's kind of being negotiated right now. And it is a very, very tricky scenario, because already many Russians, especially in the military, feel already that it's NATO against Russia. This could very easily escalate into a thermonuclear war. Vladimir Putin is someone at the end of his life who, again, has this notion of the Soviet motherland and it's all its glory. It is not a stretch to imagine that he would go out in a quote-unquote blaze of glory and use the nuclear weapons. So that's a possibility. But that's not the only tension in the world. We also have China-Taiwan tensions. We know that Taiwan is seen as a breakaway province in China's mind. Now, again, the United States has said that it will protect, it will guard Taiwan if China invades and tries to take it back and bring it within the Chinese dominion. So again, that could easily escalate into a war because, again, China now is a nuclear power. So in the Cold War, we had these two major blocks. Now it's more complicated. We have numerous countries with nuclear capability. Then, of course, how could we not forget the Middle Eastern conflict and Israel and Palestine, as well as Iran and Saudi Arabia? The Israel-Palestine thing, again, you think about consciousness here, right? You think about the fact that this same conflict just seems to, kind of like a virus, it'll go dormant for a while, but eventually it flares up again, over and over again, generation after generation, people dying on both sides. And it doesn't seem any closer to resolution than it did 50 years ago or 20 years ago. Then we've got North Korea. We've got a authoritarian dictator there who is often rattling his nuclear weapons. And of course, often there's this conflict going on between North Korea and South Korea. Again, the United States has said they will protect South Korea if North Korea tries to invade. That could easily escalate as well. Then you've also got India-Pakistan tensions as well. The point being, there are numerous either wars or deeply conflicted kind of tensions existing across the world. And the nature of each of these is such that they could very easily escalate into a global war. I just saw a friend today who was just writing a post about the attempted assassination of the Slovakian prime minister. And we know that the Iranian president died in a helicopter crash just yesterday. These are things that, again, could easily escalate because often it either is the case or it looks like it could be the case that intelligence services from different countries are actually the ones trying to assassinate these other leaders. And even if it's not true, it could be interpreted that way. Again, it's kind of a fever pitch, these things. It doesn't take much of a miscommunication for this to escalate. So this is the world we live in, is that all these tensions are co-arising and almost all of them could easily escalate. The last thing I'll say, and I want to get Janice to chime in, is that, for instance, right now, the United States is pretty overstretched in trying to play a role in some of these different conflicts. And some of the adversaries of the United States might see this as an opportunity. For instance, you could have some sort of collusion between China and Iran and Russia, and then suddenly we would be really, really overstretched, and they might see us as at a weak point, and then that could be the beginning of some sort of war. One other piece to quickly bring in is cyber war and the influence on impacting elections, trying to change the outcome of an election. This is happening too, and that's also part of this kind of new Cold War that's going on. So many, many, many tensions that are potentially very catastrophic, certainly consequential. What do you reflect on, Janice, when you hear that pretty daunting list?
Yeah, like, where I don't want to add too much. I will note that I read something somewhere today saying that one of the things we hadn't really thought about is the Russian infrastructure for detecting said weapons isn't so great, so there's also the possibility of a terrible mistake. I'm glad you talked about the cyber stuff because I think, most of us can't really conceptualize what that means. I can't entirely. I can go a little further in than the average person probably, but our infrastructure, for example, is pretty low tech in a lot of ways. I mean, the infrastructure is always lags behind the most innovative technologies. So I think a lot of infrastructure, not probably just in the U.S., but the world is pretty vulnerable. And, some of these young hackers are pretty darn good. So I don't know. I mean, I think there is a lot of concern about that. It is. I mean, I was reading the Annie Jacobson book, which I recommend if anybody really wants a sobering but very compelling assessment of where we are, called Nuclear War: A Scenario. And she was saying, if there was a nuclear strike, anyone, anywhere, and what happened was the retaliation you talked about, sort of everything. She pointed out, she said 12,000 years of civilization would be extinguished in a few hours. That's really wild to think about, right? So, and while you were talking, though, I was reflecting on, I think it was this conversation and some of our conversations where we first talked about the gender question. Because this comes back for me. I'm like, this yang, us versus them stuff is going to kill us. Like, literally, it's going to kill us. That's kind of where we're at. But how do you meet this moment? So that's a question for out there. Leave in the comments. How do we meet this moment in a way that, doesn't escalate it? And I think it's a question, and I know we'll come back to this later, not just for us as a collective and especially the policymakers, but us as individuals, because it happens in us too, right? That this us versus them, this war mentality, we have it all over the place. The United States is vulnerable. It is pretty vulnerable in a bunch of different ways. So I think everybody, I'm kind of holding my breath to see what happens in the next several months and in this election year. Anyway, we're going to hope for the best, and I'm going to work locally.
And to that point, yes, when we think about this election year, what's coming up, it's not just any typical election, of course, because what you'll often hear in the news is that this is potentially an election that could see the demise of democracy altogether in the United States. And you'll have half the population screaming that from the rooftops, while the other half doesn't seem to think that's the case at all. Or perhaps they think that, well, democracy is not working so well for us anyway, and this person is going to champion what we want, so we're okay with that. So again, we're not really learning from what history has taught us. When we think about the 20th century and the move towards democracies in a world that was very promising, you and I have had conversations about graduating high school and this sense of positivity and promise in the world, and how much things have not really panned out that way at all. And to this point, one of the other aspects that is sort of an outgrowth of this geopolitical tension is the rise of authoritarianism in the world. And I just want to touch on an article here that is discussing this. What it says in its preface here is global freedom faces a dire threat. Around the world, the enemies of liberal democracy, a form of self-government in which human rights are recognized and every individual is entitled to equal treatment under law, are accelerating their attacks. So let's get specific here. So authoritarian regimes have become more effective at co-opting or circumventing the norms and institutions meant to support basic liberties, and at providing aid to others who wish to do the same. In countries with long-established democracies, internal forces have exploited the shortcomings in their systems, distorting national politics to promote hatred, violence, and unbridled power. Those countries that have struggled in the space between democracy and authoritarianism, meanwhile, are increasingly tilting towards the latter. The global order is nearing a tipping point, and if democracy's defenders do not work together to help guarantee freedom for all people, the authoritarian model will prevail. The present threat to democracy is the product of 16 consecutive years of decline in global freedom. A total of 60 countries suffered declines over the past year, while only 25 improved. As of today, some 38% of the global population live in not free countries, the highest proportion since 1997. Only about 20% of the global population now live in what we would call free countries. So that's pretty sobering. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not going to add anything because it really is pretty sobering. And I think it just drives home a lot of the observations we've made. I take some heart in just feeling like we live in, very kind of sobering, scary times, but they're also really wild. And they're clearly historic. Like we entered historic, I don't know when. I wonder what date we entered historic. It was a little while ago, probably somewhere around 2016 or maybe even before. And boy, I don't know when we're going to end in historic. Sometimes I think, God, you could write a dissertation about a single day. There are probably days in which you could write a dissertation about a single hour of things that happened. So anyway, it's kind of where I take refuge. And I do we do this consciousness work, right? So to try to bring it home, let it start with us.
Absolutely. And I think this is probably a good juncture for us to remind everyone that one of the assumptions that Janice and I bring to the table here is that it is not an accident of history that we are here at this time while all of these different phenomena are rising, many of them being quite daunting and overwhelming, that we chose to be here for some reason, right? That this is exactly where we should be. So rather than becoming sort of paralyzed by this overarching rising tide of challenges, rather try to think about what it could be alchemically that could transmute into something that could give birth to a transformation. So I just want to remind everyone, one of our assumptions here is that, and this is empirically backed up with data when you look back at history, that you need pressure cookers, you need intensity, you need pressure to produce true transformation. Because one thing that Janice and I both agree on is that incremental change will not work here. There's just too many challenges that will overwhelm us if we just try to carry on as we have been, ticking along. We need to fundamentally change some things. And so what really would make that happen is circumstances that are so daunting that the only option really on the table is a complete rewrite of how we do things as a civilization. So while these are challenging on the one hand, on the other hand, they do hold the promise for the kind of pressure that could vault us into a truly transformational moment. So we see it that way. And this is, again, not just wishful thinking. This is the way things work. It could be the very reason why this is arising. So be open. It's intense energy, but keep that in mind when you try to process it.
Thank you so much. Because I was like, God, I'm feeling so rooted, I'm like this is the material reality. Dang, we're just screwed. But I think the deeper reality and the thing that drew us, both of us individually and everybody probably listening and lots of millions of other people to where, all these topics is there is something going on with our understanding about what the nature of reality really is. And it doesn't look to be nearly as fixed or material as it seems. That's why the consciousness, the sort of the work of the consciousness piece, not just the understanding of it, but the using of it becomes so powerful. And I know I'm like sitting here going, we will have podcasts just only on that. And it'll feel very different than this one. So thank you, though, for the reminder for everybody listening. It's not as dire as it seems once you start to scope out and see that. And it isn't a fantasy or an idea. It's real. And there's now an emerging body of science that is really helping us to elucidate how it might work. So.
Exactly. And that reminds me of this notion that you raised in the first episode of quantum activism, realizing that reality manifests as it does. It renders as it does based on how collective consciousness collapses one reality into being over another. So again, what we are partly seeing is a decoherence that's arising in the world because many people are choosing to not take part in the system anymore. So initially it looks like chaos because some of the old order is no longer holding together. But again, that's partly because some people, many people, intuitively, even if they don't consciously, maybe aren't necessarily aware of it or not cerebrally dealing with it on that level, but deep down they know something's wrong, deeply wrong, in the foundational level. And that has to crumble first before we can rebuild. So again, try to remember to think about it on the quantum level, not just on what we see on the surface.
Yeah, we'll come back to this too. I mean, we've talked about that, the drushti. I think we're withdrawing our drushti. We're basically withdrawing our gaze collectively. I think this is my hypothesis, and it is causing the dissolution. I don't know. It's a fun one to play with, but we'll come back around to that. And actually, even toward the end of this episode, maybe we should get through the rest of our topics.
Indeed. So the next one we're going to discuss is solar weather. So take it away, Janice.
This is where it starts to get at least equally fascinating and not just sobering. So I started following the sun and sun-related topics a few years ago, and it's just gotten really, really fascinating. So, for example, earlier this year, this was a topic or a headline that came up in Science Tech Daily. Solar surprise: scientists discover unprecedented high-energy light coming from the sun. Astrophysicists reveal that the sun is beaming down gamma rays with energies higher than ever measured. After looking at 6 years' worth of data, out popped this excess of gamma rays. When we first saw it, we were like, this is definitely messed up. The sun cannot be this bright at these energies. Okay, I'll stop there. It's utterly fascinating, though, right? So there's an empirical line we'll follow here in a second, but from the side of people who are interested in the way that our cosmos are all connected and the way that might be affecting our personal electromagnetic fields individually, as well as the planet, as well as activating maybe higher bands of knowing and awareness and consciousness, this is an activator. This would be an activating event, right? In the sort of material world, this is it seems to be part of what's happening. Well, we all know there's two really critical and fascinating things happening at one time. So we're near our solar maximum. These are 11-year cycles. This is 10th year in the cycle, but it was upgraded to be the maximum this year. So we're seeing a lot of sun activity. We typically do. This year, however, has been really unusually active. And I think a lot of you, in fact, Darren, you and I were talking when you were seeing some of the aurora borealis in North Carolina last weekend, right?
Yeah, southern North Carolina. So I'm 10 minutes from the Georgia border, and I've lived some pretty northerly latitudes before, but I've never seen the northern lights. So to see it here was mind-blowing. And yeah, I was talking to you on the phone, walking around in the forest streets here as I do. And at first I was like, what is that? What's that color? Oh, it's a northern lights. I was shocked and amazed that this was happening. And as I mentioned on Liminal Frames, again, there's different layers of reality, right? And different ways you can interpret this. And it felt like it was partly the imprint of some deeply symbolic aspect. So we can look at it on a physical level, and that's amazing. But it also feels like this symbolism that's pointing to exactly the consequential nature of this time.
Right. And in another episode, we'll talk about the sort of the stories and myths, right, of all the different cultures. I asked Claude AI, just as an aside, to tell me about mythologies that had empirical linkages in this time or for which there's evidence. And it went on and on and on. There are so many. Anyway, that borealis, those northern lights, was seen in Florida, Texas, and the Caribbean. And I think there were some reports even lower down. So it was really, really unusual. But it's not necessarily a good sign. So that's the part that's a little bit sobering. And that's because at the same time, because our poles, our electromagnetic poles, which do tend to wander, it's called a polar excursion, they have wandered at an increasingly fast pace, starting, I guess it was the mid-1800s. Let me see. Well, so the Earth's electromagnetic field has weakened by about 9% over the past 200 years, but it's speeding up. It's speeding up a lot. And it's created things like the South Atlantic anomaly, which is basically this big segment over the South Atlantic that has no electromagnetic sheath around it like the rest of, I mean, you don't want to go sailing underneath there and have your skin exposed, basically. But so it's speeding up. We're also overdue for what's called a pole flip. So that's when the north and south poles would flip. Scientists are divided on whether that's a nothing burger or a serious something burger. But considering that the last pole flip was 780,000 years ago, I'm going to say they probably don't have enough data to say that it really is nothing. Seems like it could be something. But even if it stays in the excursion territory and doesn't flip, one of the byproducts is degradation of our electromagnetic sheath. So that sphere that keeps the sort of harmful rays from the cosmos is more degraded even now than it's been in a very long time, which means that anything like any one of those, if we had a big CME, a coronal mass ejection, it could easily puncture our atmosphere. And in fact, we started to see in the last couple of years, especially, headlines like just recently in Scientific American, I think just a few days ago, it says the threat of a solar superstorm is growing and we're not ready. That started to come up. And that's because unlike 1859, when the Carrington event happened, this was the last big CME to hit. It took out our telegraph systems and it fried a few things. If it hit right now, something like that, it would take down our grid. I mean, it would hit all of our satellites. I mean, we have so much more hardware and software that would be affected. So that's kind of scary, possible. But these time horizons, again, are really long. Like it could be still hundreds of years before something happens. So I want people to keep that in mind. But in the meantime, it is allowing more light in, it is allowing more radiation in, and we are having more solar activity. And we are, we're living in a time when if the one part of the grid went down, probably most of it or all of it would go down because we're all interconnected. And if you're in that light worker world, then you go, this is letting in that much more light to really activate us and to help us understand and see what's really going on. I'm going to stand in sort of the middle and hope that part is true. And meanwhile, I'll watch it. I mean, there are other pieces to it that start getting really, really interesting, and maybe we can address those sometimes because it doesn't seem like it's just an Earth event. It seems like it's happening to other planets in our solar system. But this is an area where that word unprecedented has been used a lot in the last few years.
Right, and I would say a few things, reflection on this particular matter. One is that, there's something really interesting about light, right? Because we know, first of all, that it's both a particle and a wave, and that was revolutionary to understand with the dawn of quantum mechanics. But that also sort of hints at that light might be almost like this element that is both within and without space-time, and that light can be a carrier wave for consciousness and things like that. And so I was actually listening to an interview recently with someone who's doing research, academic research, somewhere down near Atlanta, trying to pursue this notion that somehow light plays this really key role. And then on that note, and you kind of hinted at this, there have been some people who have suggested that when we have these moments where there's a lot more light coming in, it does change the way our consciousness behaves, and we are able to tune into things that are different than in low light kind of situations. So there are some people that would even argue you have a lot more channeling. You have telepathic communication that can happen between civilizations and different kinds of beings that happen periodically in Earth history based on these shiftings of light and things like that. So again, it's not all bad. There's some very interesting things that come online, and some people have even argued that some ancient Earth civilizations might have been arising at one of these times, and that gave them sort of superpowers, abilities to tune into things and have capacities online that are not so much online in a low light situation. So while there are daunting challenges that come with this, Janice talked about some of them, radiation, the possibility of knocking out the grid, those kinds of things, there are also some potentials online that are also quite interesting. So we'll put that one in the fascinating category for now. Like Janice said, we'll come back to that probably in future episodes because it ties in really interesting ways with galactic weather. So there's kind of this chain reaction that happens from the galaxy to the solar to the planet. All right, so the next one we're going to discuss is UAP. Now, we have promised about this. From the first episode on, we've talked about how we will be discussing UAP. And of course, those of you familiar with me know that I do that pretty regularly on my other two podcasts, Liminal Frames and Point of Convergence. But it will be a major aspect that we would discuss here as well, a topic that is central for numerous reasons. Because on the one hand, there's just a matter of the fact that apparently non-human intelligence are in our midst, not just in Alpha Centauri, but actually here, and perhaps have been here all along. This is part of the really interesting revelation. Now, before we get into some of the reasons why we think that's the case, and we're seeing an uptick in even congressional, governmental kind of engagement on this topic, I think one thing I'd like to introduce first, then get your take on this aspect of the UAP topic as well, Janice, is that it also attenuates the other topics we've already discussed, because the fact that it's not just that we're now becoming aware of them, these others, but they actually seem to be here in a more prominent way than they have been in the past. So again, while we're seeing this rising tide of challenges in the world, we're also seeing this uptick both in the numbers and the activity of these non-human intelligences. And there are some promising historical points that we can look to that relate to some of these other daunting challenges we've talked about. So for instance, we know that one of the things that's happened historically, empirically well supported, is that at one point when we were testing a warhead with a dummy nuke on it, literally a flying saucer went up and shot this thing down. And again, that was just a dummy warhead. This was at the height of the Cold War. But you could argue that what they're basically saying is we will not stand idly by while you destroy your civilization, and just as importantly, the rest of the biosphere. We will interfere. Some people are feeling overwhelmed by the technological superiority some of these beings seem to have in comparison to us. But on the good news, if they're a benevolent species, they have the capacity to perhaps prevent us from going into a full-on thermonuclear war. So I'm curious to get your take on that, Janice. How much does that help you think differently about some of the challenges we discussed earlier in the episode?
Oh, yeah. It is really, it is my primary vector of hope, as I've said. And, this is where I'm not sure who all is listening and where you fall on this, but I think if you didn't hear the first episode, Darren and I are both absolutely abundantly clear based on years and years of research, especially Darren, who started, I don't even know how long ago, that UAP are real and present and definitely active. So that's unmistakable. And I don't know what your sense is, but it does really feel like, having now watched this really, really closely for a past few years, that in addition to whatever human elements are pushing disclosure, there does seem to be this other force that's kind of just keeps the pressure on and there are more sightings, there are more communications, there are more signaling. Seems to be a lot more signaling that can't be really chalked up to either one of these sides. But there's a lot in that black box we can't see. What we know is there's a black box. It contains a lot. It'll catapult us into an entirely different age. Change everything. But I do see it as a primary runway for both people learning about consciousness and reality, and as well as, and maybe even most importantly, for the challenges we're facing materially, vectors of hope for technology that could help us, as well as just seeing, understanding we're not alone. We're one. We're not various peoples on the planet, and these little countries were one people. We're one species that needs to be able to work together. I mean, it could really, I'm hoping it would really alter the way that people see things. That said, we both know that the message that we can't wait for a savior is really a huge part of this too. We really have to be doing our local work to show that we're capable.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because what some of the most benevolent ones of these non-human intelligences basically communicate to abductees and to contactees who've basically been in dialogue, often telepathically, with these beings, is that one of the markers for them of a mature species is the fact that it emerges as kind of a collective consciousness where decisions are made on a global scale. Now, earlier on, we talked about climate does not honor borders. Climate just is what it is, and everything's connected, and what happens in one part of the world in climate will inevitably impact every other area as well. So it wouldn't even work for us to basically try to micromanage climate in one part of the world, because there's this knock-on effect. So again, what this could do, potentially, that climate challenge, is put us better in alignment with the way things really are. And the way things really are is connected. And there's this oneness, not just in terms of spiritually, energetically, but also in terms of the systems that work together in these symbiotic biomes, and that we need to also operate as a symbiotic biome with the planet, with each other, in order to really address these issues. So In addition to that, in addition to the situation where that dummy nuke was knocked down, them perhaps saying we're not going to stand by while you do this, but there are also many cases, for those of you who don't know, where UFOs show up at our nuclear weapons facilities and literally shut down the silos. They're able to do this remotely. We don't understand it. Of course, it's a very sophisticated technology, but basically they're able to shut down those nukes. And they've done it both in the U.S. and in the Soviet Union in the height of the Cold War. Again, you're kind of getting into interpretation here, but you could make the argument, many people do make the argument, that it is either them saying, wake up, humanity. Why are you playing with these weapons? This is not a game. This is too dangerous. So it's kind of like a wake-up call. Others have argued that they're basically shutting down these weapons to make sure they can, kind of as a trial run, so that if there ever is a nuclear exchange, they know that they can handle that. Now, again, to Janice's point, we shouldn't hold all our hope and the babysitter is going to step in and prevent a nuclear war. We need to grow into a sense of collective consciousness where we handle these things differently. But it does give us hope that even if the worst case scenario will begin to roll out, that we might have help. I also want to point out, and I think this is really important, that when I think about some of the abductees and contactees from the 90s that I know personally that had contact with these beings, back then the warning was, right now, the human trajectory is very dangerous, both in terms of the environment and in terms of nuclear war and those kinds of things. And they basically gave these warnings, you've really got to change course. Now, here we are on 20, 30 years later, and we really have not changed course. We've just doubled down on the same trajectory. And of course, now you could argue that that became a prophecy that came true because we are now facing the very challenges they said we would because we didn't change course when they gave us that warning about it. That said, I also want to point out that they seem to see into the future with a larger horizon of time than we do. So the fact, again, that they're here, that there's an uptick in their behavior, their activity, both in terms of military pilots are reporting them more and seeing them more, commercial pilots are seeing them more, people in CE5 are having contact experiences with these phenomena all around the world. All of that suggests to me that they know that we're reaching this point, this really critical point, and they are here precisely because of that reason. In fact, I would point out, and I've done a few episodes on this, on Point of Convergence, that I have intelligence provided to me from people both in the U.S. intelligence circles and British intelligence circles that literally some of these beings are from the future and know that something's coming in our future and are here to help prevent it from happening. So again, all these things are really wrapped up together, and that should give us some hope and should convince us not to just look at it at the surface level, but try to see how all this is working together.
Yeah, that is really, really important. Yeah, I was also thinking, one of the first things that occurred to me is when people really get it, that these vehicles, these craft can engage in what I think it was Lou Elizondo that coined the 5 observables, which is basically they defy the laws of physics. We don't need to go into all of them here. They can move at extraordinary speeds that would kill us in a nanosecond. That it will also trigger that back to that fascination again. Like, how do they do that? That's the important question. How do they do that? Yes. Because it speaks to the layer of reality that it really feels like as part of this larger bundle of things that we track and talk about, and the UAP is definitely part of, is we're on the sort of the brink of being able to understand it's not like it seems. Reality isn't like it seems. And again, it seems to be much more malleable in ways, and you can move through and around and you can see it from different vantage points, and you're not this body. So you're just not just this. Basically, you're having an experience. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different potentials. So that also excites me because I'm like, I think people will hopefully at least start to get very curious at some point and start asking questions and start looking for their own answers. I think that's really important for me to say too to people. When people start to go down this road and they want to know, what they should read or listen to, I often give them some ideas, but it's like, you need to go satisfy yourself. And there's so many ways to do that because there's so much information. It's shocking how much information is available. So anyway, it's a fun, the most cynical part of me is like, well, I don't know how much time I have left, but at least I'll spend it learning lots of really wild stuff and, playing with concepts and talking about really interesting things and not just going to work 9 to 5, doing the same old that we do.
Absolutely. And I really do think we should look at this one as the potential X factor in this entire mix of elements that we're seeing arising, because, to Janice's point, they do have technology that's so sophisticated that they probably could, if they chose to help us, and if we chose to accept that help, could probably help us address almost all of these issues. So, for instance, one thing that Janice pointed to there that I want to give a bit more specific information about is this revolutionary energy creation. So this is known as zero-point energy. Basically, the notion here, and this has been basically theorized for a long time, is that the vacuum of space is actually not empty. It's not a vacuum. Actually, it's pulsing with energy, incredible energy. And basically what we see with their technology is that they are basically incorporating this energy in how they move their machines and how they handle their technology and power their technology. And even more specifically than that, I can let people know that I'm aware of more than one group in the world that is getting direct information from some of these beings to the end of actually helping to create these zero-point energy generation kind of machines. So this, of course, is highly consequential because not only does it allow us to change our relationship with energy, right? Because we know that climate, for instance, a major problem there is the CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere because of the fossil fuels that we've used that still basically dominate around the world. Now, if we have 0 point, then we're able to make a real dent in the way that we do these things, that overnight we could change these things. And furthermore, it could even change kind of the dominating structures where certain corporations, certain multinational corporations have been able to hold everyone else basically at hostage because of our need for oil, basically our reliance on oil and fossil fuels. So this could fundamentally change things because the idea is with some of these machines that are using 0 point energy, once you start it up, it just keeps running. It doesn't need additional fuel to be put in. And that could even potentially change our relationship with work. When you start thinking about all of the knock-on effects, it's really, really promising. And this is, again, not just a dream. These beings are here. They're increasing their activity. They are giving information to human beings, some of the groups that I'm actually connected with, about how we would actually do these things. I'm working with some groups that are actually trying to figure out how to engineer this now. So this is, again, it's not just pie in the sky. This is happening at this time. And again, I would argue it's because of the very vortex of things arising right now that it is happening at this time.
Awesome. All right. Well, so how about we segue from here to quantum physics, because that is the last sort of large domain, but it's perfectly linked because it is striking. As we said earlier, there's all these different adjacent kinds of topic areas that are definitely adjacent to the ones we've talked about here. But you start sort of following the strands, you kind of naturally end up in a lot of these living rooms. And what's happening technologically and in science, and especially the breakthrough in the areas related to quantum physics and so forth, is just mind-blowing. And it's how can it feels not coincidental that as all these other forces are sort of reaching crescendo and disclosures in the offing in a very real way, that we are also having, unprecedented, to bring that word back in again, breakthroughs all over the place. So I was going to start here. There's a number of things I was going to talk about, but we'll just go. I want to see whether you track this one too. I think they talk about it as quantum Darwinism, but this idea that there's some missing law of evolution, that because it has been observed not just in biology, not just across ecological systems, but cosmologically or in the cosmos, that the process of quantum physics seems to select for greater complexity. So it isn't as though it's just sort of random. It's random selection and whatever seems to survive. It actually searches for systems that may not be the easiest. They wouldn't naturally come through sort of Darwin's original theory in the way that it works, but there's intelligence there. There's some form of intelligence. And, so it was just not even that long ago that there was a paper in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences that included a unique multidisciplinary team of philosophers, astrobiologists, data science, mineralogists, theoretical physicists, all came together to talk about what they call a missing law of nature, recognizing for the first time that these systems tend to evolve toward efficient complexity and that there's an intelligence there. It was controversial, but the cross-disciplinary nature of the team, the fact that it matches the empirical data in a novel and interesting way, and it just makes sense given everything else that's coming to the forefront, like things we were talking about, is very exciting to me. So tell me what you think about that.
It is exciting. And one of the things I find most compelling about that is that it kind of echoes what we've been told in ancient Vedic traditions and ancient cosmologies around the nature of reality, that you basically have from source, from undifferentiated consciousness, you have the unfolding of physical reality coming out from that, and then it unfolds back into source. You have what is called evolution and involution. And there's kind of, to use a theological term, kind of a teleological aspect to it, where it has a directionality. It seems to have, like you say, an intelligence behind it. It seems driven by some sort of purpose, which again flies in the face of what we've been taught under physicalist tenets about these things have no purpose, there is no meaning. Try to make sense of your life and enjoy it while you operate under those kind of principles. So yes, we are seeing that it's kind of re-enchanting the world, right? Re-enchanting the cosmos. And when you pair with that this notion that the observer plays a critical role in how reality actually manifests, that at first some of these revolutionary quantum experiments, of course, wanted to find out how exactly does this work. And they found, to their great surprise, and it was a shock to the system that is still being metabolized even today, 100 years later, that just by looking, the act of looking, the role that we play, seems to play a participatory role in what even unfolds in reality itself. So then we start thinking, wait a second, this again fits with some of these ancient Vedantic traditions around the co-authoring aspect we have as human beings, which again, in light of what we talked about today, some of the challenges, again, it all comes down to consciousness, and it's all within our heads. We not only can respond to physical reality, but the way we relate to ourselves and to these deeper energetic currents literally changes how physical reality manifests. So that, I think, is promising in terms of where things could go. What do you think about that?
Oh, yeah. I love that. Yeah. I remember when I had to watch the slit screen experiment like 20 times. I was like, whoa, it's a particle in a way that makes so much sense. It like explains everything. In fact, I think I learned not long ago that if you took all the particles, the actual matter in any one of us, and you separate it out from the energy, because the rest is energy. Because as you said, there's nothing that's not moving here. That's been pretty well definitively shown. Like everything is in motion, even if it looks like empty space. But if you could separated the energy from the matter in us, the matter in us would fit in a thimble. It's crazy, right? So when you start to really go down that road, and especially since there's so much empirical knowing about the way some of these things work, although the fact that they hardly ever make their way into textbooks, I don't understand that, because we do know quite a bit about the way that the quantum world at least looks. We don't know exactly, I think, why, although that's maybe the next frontier. Yeah, anyway, and the particle wave thing is a wonderful potential explanatory mechanism for how the world ends up looking in any given moment. And I love that you pointed out that we do know a lot, because a lot of the most ancient scriptures we have on the planet have articulated it kind of exactly the way it works. They just don't use standard scientific language. But it is starting to fully come together in ways that are striking if you just take a cursory look. I think the other piece, there's two more quantum principles that I'd love to get your take on. One of them that goes along with this is the entanglement, right? The idea that there are particles that are entangled, and it wouldn't matter where they existed. You could have them on different sides of the universe, and when you pinch one, the other one would react. It really calls into question the whole idea of space and time in ways that are completely novel. So do you want to share a little bit more about what you know about quantum entanglement?
Yeah, that one is fascinating. And yes, really just want to highlight again that many of the revelations coming out of the quantum mechanical experiments actually seems to suggest a nature of reality that's a lot like the cosmologies described in some of these ancient traditions. So what could this mean? To bring up Janice's point again, you take these two particles and you could put them apparently on opposite ends of the cosmos. And if you change the orientation of one, the other one immediately changes simultaneously, which seems to violate classical physics, which says that you can only send a signal from one to the other at the speed of light. And clearly it's happening immediately. There is no way it can be happening in terms of a message being passed. So then, as Janice hinted at there, what that seems to call into question is space and time real at all? One of the fascinating aspects of quantum mechanical experiments has been that even realism has been undone. And this speaks to what Janice and I talked about in the first episode, where this notion that reality is one fixed thing and we just need to measure it at a precise enough level and we'll figure it out. That's not what it is at all. That when you look really closely at a microscale, it just gets blurry and you realize you can't separate you as the observer, as an agent of consciousness, from what you're actually observing. So then, of course, I think to your point about why we're not seeing this more in textbooks is because it's so revolutionary that many people just do not want to look at it. In the same way that we talk about some of these daunting challenges we're facing as a civilization, some people just would rather look the other way because it's overwhelming. In the same way, in a world that has been structured around physicalist tenets, this undoes all of that. And many people are just not ready to look at it, even though, again, it's empirically supported really, really well. So I think, these last couple topics, both UAP and what that means, both in terms of technology, our larger cosmic family, the interconnected nature of things, right? So speaking of what you just said with entanglement also means that everything's connected. And of course, that's exactly the messages that so many of these beings are expressing too, that this is something they've known for a long time. And in our non-dual circles that are part of both of our backgrounds, this is called the illusion of separation, right? So what basically entanglement is telling us is that it is illusory. Space-time is illusory, that ultimately this all is expressions of the same fundamental thing. And that, of course, not only changes how we think about the world, but how we think about each other and how we even think about self-interest. So yeah, on that point, that relates to something we discussed again in the first episode and hinted at in the second episode in terms of the malleability of reality itself, that because of the interconnected nature, because actually it's one substance and only in an illusory sense seems separate, that means we have an incredible power as agents of consciousness to change not only how we respond to the physical world, but again, to what the physical world manifests as. And while we spoke earlier about the decoherence that is going on right now, as more and more of us grok that, and more of us want to respond and grow a world that reflects that kind of interconnected nature, we have that potential within us. Again, when you think about these beings, or you think about indigenous cultures, or you think about ancient Eastern cosmologies, they're all saying the same thing. So we are really coming into alignment with the way things really are. And as everyone knows, that's always the better way to be in relationship with reality, is you're reflecting the principles that it's built upon. And that's what is being offered to us right now. It's a remarkable moment of potential. And we just want to finish with that even though we began with some pretty daunting statistics in climate change, geopolitical strife, even solar events, these last couple that we've talked about, again, promise so much potential, not just incremental changes here and there, but truly transformative potential. That's what we really want to focus in on here. And part of what we want to remind everyone as we head out here is that whether it feels negative or positive initially, try to learn to be with the energy, to metabolize the energy, to keep this overarching sense of what this is all about, how these things actually work at the most cosmic level in mind when we deal with these things, including the fact that we are more than just this body-mind. We are multidimensional beings ourselves. What does that mean, and how might that change how we greet this particular moment in time? Any other final thoughts from you, Janice?
Yeah, just kind of what I said in the first podcast. You are your own data. You don't even have to go out there and look, just sort of study yourself. Those anomalous things you think and feel, those odd sensations, those dreams, they may be the part of something that's bigger than anything that you ever really assigned to it. So yeah, enjoy exploring there, and we'll keep talking here together.
Absolutely. And that's going to bring us to a close of another edition of the podcast. We hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks' time for Event Horizon.